Hi everyone, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion of the cranial nerves. This time we're going to be talking about cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. Now if you haven't already watched the videos I put together regarding cranial nerves 5 and 7, you'll probably want to do that first because a lot of the terminology I'll be using here is going to take those for granted. So feel free to go spend some quality time with those. But we're going to start off this video with cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. And we're going to start by reiterating something we saw in the cranial nerve 5 discussion. The sensory ganglia associated with the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, sense various modalities of afferent inputs from the head and the neck. And what we talked about before was that we've got a chief sensory nucleus of 5 in the pons. We've got a mesencephalic trigeminal nucleus in the midbrain. And most important for today, in the medulla, stretching all the way down to the spinal cord and extending in lamina 2 of the dorsal or posterior horn of the spinal cord, we've got what's referred to as the spinal trigeminal nucleus. And this is the nucleus that receives inputs from painful, temperature-based receptors in the skin of the face. So here is the spinal trigeminal nucleus. All right, so we're going to start with those guys, and we're starting there because cranial nerves 9 and 10 make use of these central nuclei. And cranial nerve 9, amongst the things that it has, are what's called GSA modality, general somatic afferent. Somatic because we're aware of it. It's something that, if you get poked in the face by a pen or something jabs you in the back of the throat, you are aware of it. And afferent meaning sensory. So cranial nerve 9 contains GSA modalities, and to get to the body, cranial nerve 9 has to exit the skull at some point. And it does so by going through a nice big hole in the posterior cranial fossa called the jugular foramen. And so it extends to the spinal trigeminal nucleus, exits the jugular foramen, and the GSA inputs from cranial nerve 9 come from a few different places. They come from the pharynx, the throat, essentially. They come from the middle ear and the tympanic tube, the auditory tube, and they come from the posterior third of the tongue. So we'll start by going to the middle ear. To get there, branches of 9 have to peel off and re-enter the skull through a little tiny hole. It's called the tympanic canaliculus, or little tiny canal of the ear. And so it travels back to reach the middle ear, and it forms a tympanic plexus of nerves in there. And this is how sensory inputs to the middle ear get there. And so anytime you have a middle ear infection or you have a child with a middle ear infection, this is the nerve that's telling you how painful that is. Also, the auditory tube and the mastoid air cells have their sensory inputs going back to the central nervous system by way of cranial nerve 9. Now the next place cranial nerve 9 innervates is the entire back of the throat. And what I mean by back of the throat is the pharynx. So posterior to the nasal cavity, posterior to the oral cavity, and posterior to the larynx, we have the pharynx. And it's basically that kind of stocking of muscle that narrows down into the esophagus and leading to the stomach. So the pharynx gets its sensory input from 9. And the last little branch of 9 that we're going to worry about that contains GSA fibers goes relatively nearby. It goes to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. All right, so that's it for the GSA inputs from 9. Next up, we have another sensory modality, and that is going to be called SVA, special visceral afferent. Now special in this case means it's a special sensory modality. Visceral in this case means it's coming from a mucosal lined surface, and afferent once again means that it is sensory. So the place it is sensory to is the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And you might remember from the cranial nerve 7 video that SVA modality covers taste. And so these taste fibers travel back along cranial nerve 9. If I haven't apologized already for being left-handed and blocking out the screen part of the time, mea culpa. Now one thing I want to mention here is, as we cross into the jugular foramen, before we go any further, I want to remind you that sensory cells have their cell bodies not initially inside the central nervous system, but in peripheral ganglia. And cranial nerves 9 and 10 are no different. So just like there's a posterior or a dorsal root ganglia outside in the body, these sensory axons have their cell bodies located in peripheral ganglia. So right here is a pseudounipolar axon containing GSA fibers, and here's peripheral ganglia containing SVA fibers. And these guys are found very close to the jugular foramen. And in fact, let me color this in, they form sometimes distinct but closely related superior and inferior glossopharyngeal ganglia. So there's the superior and inferior glossopharyngeal ganglia. And these are relatively hard to spot in the laboratory, so if you're trying to dissect these out, you have to look really close to the jugular foramen. And so, axons from these pseudounipolar sensory neurons stretch to the periphery to innervate whatever it is they're receiving input from, and then the remaining part of the axon stretches back to the central nervous system. And in this case, taste fibers enter, and they go to a specific nucleus in the brainstem that we've talked about with cranial nerve 7, but we'll hit it again. This guy is called the solitary nucleus, and it's where taste and other viscerosensory inputs travel. And it's called the solitary nucleus because there's a group of cells surrounded by a white matter tract, so it kind of looks like a donut. And since it involves taste, that's a nice little correlation first there. And these axons come in, synapse with the solitary nucleus, and will then decussate and extend up to the thalamus to tell our body what things taste like. All right, that's it for SVA fibers related to cranial nerve 9. We got one more sensory modality to hit up. We're going to color it slightly similarly, but hopefully different enough that you can see the contrast. And these fibers I'll refer to as GVA, general visceral afferent. Now, general visceral afferents do something interesting. They project also to the solitary nucleus. And so we're going to draw in the projection to the solitary nucleus there. But they project to its kind of inferior or caudal extent. Taste fibers go to the kind of rostral or the cranial part, and visceral sensory fibers go to its caudal part. And we'll hit that a little harder when we get to 10. But here, because it's sensory, it's got some cell bodies peripherally. We're going to draw this pseudounipolar guy hanging out here in the inferior glossopharyngeal ganglion, which is generally where they're at. The superior glossopharyngeal ganglion contains the GSA nerve cell bodies, whereas the inferior tends to contain the SVA and GVAs. Just a fun little piece of trivia for you. And what this guy does is extends to some sensory receptors located at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery into the internal and external. And these guys are the carotid body and the carotid sinus. And they're detecting changes in blood pressure as well as blood gas composition. And one easy way to keep those straight is the carotid sinus detects blood pressure. So think of sinus pressure, and the carotid body detects differences in CO2 and O2 as it's heading to the brain in the internal carotid artery. So inputs from these guys travel back through cranial nerve 9 to reach the brainstem and update the brain on how much blood pressure and what the oxygenation or carbon dioxide levels in the blood are, which sounds reasonably important, and it is. All right, we've finished off the sensory modalities associated with cranial nerve 9. Now we're going to move on to motor activity associated with 9. Now the first one we're going to add here in purple. This modality is referred to as SVE, special visceral efferent. And I really dislike this term because there's not really anything visceral about it. It is efferent, meaning that it's motor. These axons extend to muscles that were created by the pharyngeal arches. And again, I have another video on the pharyngeal arches, so feel free to check that out anytime you want to. And the reason we've got these things grouped into distinct modalities is not out of malice or the desire to keep our teaching jobs by making it excessively difficult. It's because the brain and central nervous system actually parceled these different functionalities into discrete nuclei. So the nucleus that sends SVE fibers out through cranial nerves 9 and 10 is referred to as the awesome name of the nucleus ambiguus. I haven't labeled those guys yet, so let's label the solitary and nucleus ambiguus. That's how it's spelled, so sorry about that. So these are efferents, they're motor fibers. So we've got nerve cells hanging out in the nucleus ambiguus that send axons out, and these guys join with cranial nerve 9 inside the skull, exits along with cranial nerve 9 through jugular foramen, passes through, and this is going to go to any muscles derived from the third pharyngeal arch, which is the arch that was innervated by cranial nerve 9 during early development. And for whatever reason, the only muscle that cranial nerve 9 innervates from those arches is a single pharyngeal muscle called the stylopharyngeus. And this is a long vertical muscle, mostly vertical, that inserts into the rest of the pharyngeal muscles and elevates it during swallowing. So, fun piece of trivia for you there. So that's it for SVE, and we've got one modality left for cranial nerve 9. And this one's a little more complex, but also a little more high yield clinically. So you want to know what's going on here for your board exams as well as for your foreseeable future in the health sciences. In blue, we're going to draw in GVE. Now, GVE, general visceral efferent, means the same thing as autonomic, parasympathetic or sympathetic. Because we're dealing with cranial nerves, it has to be a parasympathetic nucleus that's involved, because sympathetics only are found initiating from the T1 to about the L2 region of the spinal cord, whereas in the brainstem and sacral regions you have parasympathetic general visceral efferent inputs. So we're going to draw in a little cell nucleus here that's extending an axon, a motor axon, out to cranial nerve 9. And this guy is the parasympathetic, presynaptic parasympathetic nucleus associated with 9. That is the inferior salivatory nucleus. You may remember the superior salivatory nucleus was associated with cranial nerve 7, innervated the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands, the lacrimal gland, some of the secretory glands inside the air sinuses and palate. Inferior salivatory nucleus innervates the parotid gland, the big salivary gland on the side of our face. And to do that, it has a ridiculously complicated course. And so we'll follow it here. It exits the jugular foramen. No big surprises there. But then these fibers peel off and travel through the tympanic canaliculus and join with the middle ear, auditory tube innervating tympanic plexus there. But instead of staying there, they travel on the surface of the petrosal portion of the temporal bone. And at this point, these parasympathetic fibers go by the name of the lesser petrosal nerve. You may remember from the other video that the greater petrosal nerve is from 7. So salivary inputs and petrosal nerves go together. Now these travel anteriorly and a little bit medially through the middle cranial fossa until they reach a nice round hole in the skull called the foramen ovale. And that's where cranial nerve V3, the mandibular branch of the trigeminal, is exiting. And we'll draw him in here real quick. Here's V3. Hope you can see that. V3 coming down. And it's going to branch into the buccal branch, the inferior alveolar nerve, the lingual nerve, and the auriculotemporal nerve. And this guy, lesser petrosal, is going to jump onto the V3 as it comes up the foramen ovale, but it's peripheral ganglion. And all parasympathetics in the head and neck have a peripheral ganglion associated with them. It's found on the medial aspect of the trigeminal's V3 branch. Now this is ridiculously difficult to see in the lab. You basically have to look at the medial side of V3 as it exits the foramen ovale, and you might see a slightly notable bump on it where these cell bodies are located, but it's pretty obscure, and you generally have to do cell stains to detect that those cell bodies are there. But they are, and these postsynaptic parasympathetics stretch from this ganglion, which I should label, is the otic ganglion, jump onto the auriculotemporal nerve and follow it slightly posteriorly and superiorly to reach its target, the parotid salivary gland. All right, now that is cranial nerve 9, all of its functionalities that we care about right here. And we're going to jump now to cranial nerve 10. Now cranial nerve 10 is not so bad in the light of cranial nerve 9 in that they both contain the same modalities. They just contain them in differing ratios depending on what they're doing. So whereas cranial nerve 9 has very little SVE, just that one little muscle, the stylopharyngeus, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, has a ton of SVE input to the pharynx and the palate and so on. So we'll cover that in just the next section. All right, we're back with cranial nerve 10 as promised. Like I said before, we got the same modalities here coming into play, but now we're dealing with the kind of more broadly based, or at least more extensively traveled, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve, similar nuclei, we'll add a couple more in a second here, and same exit from the jugular foramen as cranial nerve 9. So the two are quite similar in a lot of ways. And I should mention the jugular foramen really exists kind of right around here, in reality, down by the base of the brainstem, but for purpose of being able to see what's going on, taking a little artistic license and moved it way up here. So the first thing we're going to do is start with the motor activity related to 10. So the GVE parasympathetic inputs were discussed briefly with 9 in relation to the inferior salivatory nucleus. Now cranial nerve 10 has a huge nucleus dedicated to housing these presynaptic parasympathetic axons, and it goes by the extremely helpful name of the dorsal motor nucleus of 10, or the dorsal vagal motor nucleus. So we'll draw him in here, sitting alongside the solitary nucleus in red, and the nucleus ambiguous in purple. So we'll just add a little caption here. So that is the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, or of 10, right there. Now, just like before, these are motor axons, so they're going to have discrete cell bodies that project outward, forming the vagus nerve, which exits the jugular foramen. No big surprises here. And these parasympathetics don't really do a whole lot in the head and neck. They do a ton in the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities. So here, they're going to stretch down, down, through the carotid sheath alongside the common carotid artery, internal jugular vein, through the neck, down into the chest, and they basically travel to the viscera of the thorax, the heart, and the bronchi, travel into the abdomen to reach the foregut and the midgut organs, and when they reach the organ that they're innervating, they synapse with a peripheral, small, intramural ganglion and a very short postsynaptic parasympathetic axon. From the wall of that organ goes to the mucosal surfaces in it, the smooth muscle within it, and so forth. And so cranial nerve 10 supplies parasympathetic or GVE input to the thoracic viscera, the midgut viscera, I should add the foregut viscera first, so go in order. Thoracic viscera, foregut viscera, midgut viscera, and finally the hindgut viscera is supplied parasympathetics by the sacral spinal cord. So if that doesn't make any sense and you need to know it, I have a specific video about that. Go hunt it down. But that is pretty much what the parasympathetic input for 10 is doing. It's heading all the way out of the head, through the neck, into the chest and abdomen. Now, just like we have motor input to organs, we also need to know what they're doing. We need to have sensory receptors inside them to update the central nervous system about what's going on. And these sensory axons go the opposite direction. They go up towards the brain and brainstem, following the vagus nerve. And since they're sensory, gotta remember, they're going to have those pseudo-unipolar axons hanging out and heading back. Now, these guys have colored in kind of a lightish pink because they're GVA, general visceral afferents. Now, here's one slightly tricky part about cranial nerve 10, is that these general visceral afferents are a lot like the carotid body and carotid sinus inputs from cranial nerve 9, in that they extend to the caudal portion of the solitary nucleus. And as we said before, the rostral or superior portion receives taste fibers. It's sometimes referred to as the gustatory nucleus. The inferior portion receives inputs from the thoracic viscera, foregut, and midgut, and it's also sometimes referred to as the cardiorespiratory nucleus, because it's sensing the heart's activity and will, in conjunction with the dorsal motor nucleus of 10, change the rate of the heartbeat, modify the blood pressure so that we're continuing to be able to function. So the vagus nerve is really at the root of maintaining our blood pressure and maintaining our ability to not pass out or have a basal vagal syncope and not pass out and fall over. And that's one reason it makes sense that these two are so close together. Solitary nucleus and dorsal motor nucleus of 10 in space are actually very close to each other and can communicate rather quickly. All right, so those are the receptors coming from the foregut, midgut, and thoracic viscera. There are also some little pressure receptors in the arch of the aorta, so we'll just draw those in too. There's baroreceptors in the aortic arch, and those are also GVA, and travel back with the vagus accordingly, right there. All right, so we've got the GVAs taken care of. Let's jump over here to the GSAs, and the vagus nerve does have a significant amount of input to the trigeminal nuclei because it's going to be responsible for some of the things that we are willfully aware of. So they're all going to wind up in the trigeminal nucleus. We'll draw that in here. No big shock. It's going to stretch those axons out to the jugular foramen, and since it's sensory, we're going to draw in its pseudo-unipolar axons, cell body right there. And the vagus nerve is going to supply inputs to a few different places: the ear canal, the dura mater, and the epiglottic region of the tongue, and probably most confusingly, the larynx. So we'll spend the most time on the larynx. Let's start with the simple ones. Slightly simple is a branch from the vagus peels back and re-enters the jugular foramen to supply the dura mater, the coating of the inside of the skull that protects the brain and the brainstem. And dura mater is pretty exquisitely sensitive to pain, especially cranial dura mater, and is innervated by cranial nerve 10. So long-standing debilitating headaches sometimes have a dural source, and modulating the function of the pain inputs to it can make a little bit of a difference in people's lives sometime. So then, next is we have another weird little branch that heads out and innervates the ear canal. And the ear canal is innervated by cranial nerves 7, 5, and 10. And 10 doesn't have a huge input, although it's going to be tending to be one of the deepest and innervating the external aspect of the tympanic membrane. One thing I found interesting was that some people I know have described that if they stick a Q-tip way too far in their ear, they'll actually make themselves nauseated. That's because they're triggering a vagal response that's then making their guts a little unhappy and causing a little bit of a visceral reaction. So sometimes you can have a reflex where the ear canal stimulates the rest of the vagal activity. All right, so that's dura mater, that's ear canal. Let's head down to the next step along the way, and that's going to be the epiglottic region. And the epiglottic region is just posterior to the tongue. And it contains, mucosa, and if you have something get lodged there, your vagus nerve is going to let you know that something's not quite right by triggering a GSA axon and giving you a heads up that something's lodged in your craw. Now, more interestingly is the epiglottis, like the tongue, has some taste buds located on it. And just like 9, where we had sensory GSA and sensory SVA, there's some little taste buds in the epiglottic region, and those jump onto, their axons rather, jump onto cranial nerve 10. Cell bodies are out here peripherally. We'll draw this going back. And this is taste. So it's projecting to the solitary nucleus, but hopefully you guys are followed along and got the sense that it's going to go to the rostral portion of the solitary nucleus, the gustatory center, right there. All right, and fun enough, we've got these cell bodies clustered together just like we did in the glossopharyngeal nerve. And right here, we're going to have the superior and inferior vagal ganglia. And just like ganglia, pretty much anywhere else, these guys are containing sensory cell bodies related to these cranial nerves. So trigeminal ganglion in 5, the sensory ganglion related to 7, the geniculate ganglion, and then superior and inferior glossopharyngeal and vagal ganglia contain sensory nerve cell bodies and send axons out peripherally and back centrally. I think we beat that to death, but it's the last time you get to hear it, so enjoy that. All right, so we've got sensory input taken care of. We've got visceral afferents, we've got special visceral afferents, we've got general somatic afferents. Let's add some more of the really crazy efferents that we're dealing with here. And the crazy efferents that we're dealing with here are going to be related to the nucleus ambiguus. Now, cranial nerve 9 had input from the nucleus ambiguus to one muscle, the stylopharyngeus. The rest of it contains cell bodies that bundle with cranial nerve 10 and innervate pretty much the entire pharynx, the entire palate, and anything derived from the pharyngeal arches 4 and 6. So that includes laryngeal muscles as well. We're going to hit those up in just a second and add their sensory modalities along with it. Now, first thing, we have branches of the vagus that head off to the pharynx. And it innervates pretty much all the muscles except the stylopharyngeus. So the superior, middle, and inferior pharyngeal constrictors that kind of collapse the pharynx and allow food to be swallowed, and some longitudinal ones, the salpingopharyngeus muscle, the palate-pharyngeus muscle, the palatoglossus muscle, the levator veli palatini muscle, and the smooth muscle, not the smooth muscles, pardon me, the skeletal muscle of the soft palate, including the uvula. So pretty much all the palate and all the pharynx except the stylopharyngeus is innervated by cranial nerve 10. And so what we spotted here is a nice little reflex arc. Cranial nerve 9 senses what happens on or happens to the pharynx. So if I'm got a pharynx here and I jab the pharynx, 9 detects it, sends the information back to the brainstem, and to get that jab taken care of, your cranial nerve 10 sends axons from the nucleus ambiguus out that cause it to contract, and that's your gag reflex. So gag reflex, afferent limb is 9, efferent limb is 10. And loss of the gag reflex tells you you've got a problem with either 9 or 10, and you need to follow that up. One other thing that board exam books in particular love to nail you with on cranial nerve 10 is it innervates the soft palate and the muscles of the uvula. Now the uvula is that little dangly thing in the back of your throat hanging down from the soft palate. I'm going to try to get my hands in position here, and it's pretty much dangling down. Now let's just say this is one side, this is the other. If they're both innervated properly, then when you swallow, the soft palate rises and is going to block off your nasal cavity from any fluid or whatever else that's in your pharynx. If you de-innervate it, you lose cranial nerve 10, and let's just say this side gets lost and it's weak, the tone, the muscle tone on this other side pulls the uvula towards the good side. So if you have a uvula that is deflected one direction or another, it points away from the lesion because the strong musculature on one side pulls the rest of the uvula over. All right, so that's a little clinical vignette for you guys there. Next up, we've got the muscles of the larynx, and this is going to be a lot of fun. As the vagus nerve travels down through the neck, it sends off a superior laryngeal nerve. So the vagus nerve creates the superior laryngeal nerve. And it has an external motor branch. So we'll draw that in here. There's the external branch. And it innervates some muscles of the larynx. And the muscle of the larynx that it innervates out here, the one that we talk the most about usually, is going to be called the cricothyroid. And whenever you see crico or thyroid applied to one of these muscles, it's talking about the laryngeal cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid cartilage, and later the arytenoid cartilages. And these are the guys that are involved in speaking. Now, the laryngeal function probably deserves its own video, and maybe I'll get to that before too long. The other little branch out here that gets its motor innervation from the superior laryngeal nerves, external branch, is the cricopharyngeus muscle, and it's just the inferiorest most part of the inferior pharyngeal constrictor, and it's generally closed. And when we swallow, it has to relax, and at that point, food can pass down through it, and we get into the esophagus. So cricopharyngeus sometimes is treated as a separate muscle, but it's really just the tail end of the pharynx and the start of the esophagus. Now, the cricothyroid muscle, we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. I'm going to jump modalities here real quick and say that the vagus nerve is also sensory to the larynx, and these sensory fibers hang out and travel on the superior laryngeal nerve as well, but they create, or not create, but they pass through the thyroid membrane and form the internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. And this is sensory to the larynx, but only to the area that is above the true vocal fold. So, what do we care about that? Well, we care because if you have fluid or something solid like a peanut get into your larynx, that's bad news. You've just aspirated something and you want to expel it. So sensory to this area lets us know that something's entered our larynx, and it's going to trigger a reflex that causes us to cough or, just kind of expel whatever fluid's there. So we're going to start coughing. And if you have dysfunction of the vagus nerve, you wind up with a loss of not only your gag reflex, potentially, but also your ability to not aspirate fluid. And I know someone this happened to, and one of the things that she complained the most about was that she kept on aspirating things and coughed all the time until it got better. All right, so we've covered the superior laryngeal nerve. Shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody that there's also going to be an inferior laryngeal nerve. But the way we get that is, let's just say, wacky. And the way we get it is the vagus nerve also sends these motor fibers switch colors real quick, we'll come back to that. Down through the vagus nerve into the neck and into the thoracic cavity. And these motor fibers travel all the way down into the thoracic cavity before they loop back around. And on the left, they loop around the arch of the aorta. On the right, they loop around the subclavian artery. And then these motor fibers head back up to get to the larynx. And in the process, they get renamed. This is now going to be referred to as the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Laryngeal, there we go. Nerve. And on the left and right, they have a slightly different course. The left extends much further down into the thorax, around to the arch of the aorta, and the right around the subclavian artery on the right. And they're heading back to the larynx that's inferior to the vocal fold. And just to not keep you in suspense, because I know you're dying of anticipation, these sensory fibers parallel it and also make up part of the recurrent laryngeal nerve. And these sensory fibers head across and complete this loop. They are going to be sensory to the larynx, inferior to the true vocal fold. So whether we have something get lodged in our larynx superior to the vocal fold or inferior to the vocal fold, it's always cranial nerve 10 that lets us know something was going wrong there. Now along the way, it's traveling up along the trachea, and so it also has sensory branches, mix up my colors here, that go to the trachea. So should fluid or a peanut or something like that get that far down, you will be aware of it, and it's your cranial nerve 10 that is going to be making you aware of it. All right, so completing this motor activity, we've got really something interesting going on. The recurrent laryngeal nerve travels all the way up into the larynx, and these fibers from the nucleus ambiguus innervate the muscles of phonation. And phonation means speaking. So there you go, muscles of phonation. If that's all you need to know for your class, congratulations. But we'll do a little bit more detail on this right now. The one thing I hesitate to add this, but I have to, is for whatever reason, this ceases to be the recurrent laryngeal nerve as it approaches the larynx and it becomes the inferior laryngeal nerve. So we anatomists are not happy unless we're changing things names all the time. Sorry. So inferior laryngeal nerve containing the sensory to the larynx below the true vocal fold and motor to the muscles of phonation. So the muscles of phonation are the ones that allow us to speak. And one of these guys, the odd man out, is still right way up here, the cricothyroid. Now, muscles of phonation allow us to speak by tensing, relaxing, and opening our true vocal folds so that we can have more or less airflow go through and control the rate of vibration of those folds. The cricothyroid is a fun one because it tilts the thyroid cartilage forward on the cricoid, tensing the vocal folds. So if my external branch of the superior laryngeal nerve, or the superior laryngeal nerve itself, or the whole vagus nerve were to get lesioned, one thing I wouldn't be able to do is modulate the tone of my voice. And I'd wind up talking like this, and it would be very monotone, and I wouldn't be able to really make any sort of an emphasis on anything one way or the other. And that would just be awful. So that's the cricothyroid muscle that tenses the vocal fold. The other muscles of phonation, there's lots of them, and I'm only going to list the biggies. There's lots of little tiny muscles in here we're not going to worry about. The biggies do a few different things. One thing they do is adduct the true vocal folds. So if my fingers here, there we go, are the true vocal folds, adducting means bringing them closer together. And that narrows the airway going to the trachea. So it's going to soften the voice or modulate the voice a little bit. So adduction of the vocal folds is accomplished by the lateral cricoarytenoid. And if it hasn't been clear already, I'll just say the name of these muscles tells you what cartilages they go between. So lateral cricoarytenoid goes between the cricoid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilages. If you didn't catch that, you're welcome. Other ones that adduct are going to be the transverse and oblique arytenoid muscles that pull the two arytenoid cartilages, where my thumbs are, closer together. And that's going to be what adducts them. The vocal fold itself, we already said, can get tensed by the cricothyroid muscle stretching the thyroid cartilage forward. But there's also muscles that run along the true vocal fold, and when they contract, they're going to adjust the tension on the vocal fold in a pretty fine manner. And adjusting the tension of the fold is done largely by the thyroarytenoid muscle and one called the vocalis muscle. It's running along the true vocal cord. All right, so those guys are major players in phonation. The biggest one of massive clinical importance is a single muscle that does one thing. It abducts the vocal cords. So abducting the vocal cords means that the vocal cords here are my fingers, the arytenoid cartilages kind of my thumbs and hands. This one muscle opens these guys wide so that you can breathe quickly. If you're running, you don't want a tiny little narrow airway. You want this open as wide as you can. And likewise, if you're shouting, you want your vocal cords vibrating away like mad. And the abducting muscle is the posterior cricoarytenoid. Always spell that wrong. Arytenoid. And this is the muscle that abducts the folds. Now, when you have a lesion of the descending vagus nerve, or the recurrent laryngeal nerve, or the inferior laryngeal nerve, all of these guys on the affected side will be affected. But the one that really makes its mark clinically is denervation of the posterior cricoarytenoid. Because if this side is intact, this side is weak, I can't abduct it. It doesn't get out of the way. So even if this one moves to open the airway, this one's just loose and it's flapping in the breeze. And people have a hoarse voice because they can't adjust the volume. So hoarseness or difficulty speaking points to a problem with the vagus nerve affecting these muscles of phonation. All right. The one other thing we didn't discuss is that dysfunction of the vagus nerve also causes difficulty swallowing. If the pharynx is denervated or dysfunctional, you got problems there. All right. That takes us to the end of cranial nerve 10. It's doing a lot, but try to think of cranial nerves 10 and 9 and the commonalities between the two, and it'll be a little bit easier for you to keep track of who's doing what. All right, we're going to come back and finish up with cranial nerves 11 and 12. All right, so moving on from cranial nerve 10, we are going to go to, no shock, cranial nerve 11 and 12. Now, one thing I want you to get a sense of is cranial nerve 9, 10, 11, and 12 all have their nuclei in a relatively tight space, hanging out here, mostly in the medulla, and then down to the cervical spinal cord, and they're all extending up through the jugular foramen and coming down. So all of this is happening simultaneously, and just to make things slightly clearer, we're going to toss aside our nice little picture of cranial nerve 10 here, and draw in cranial nerves 11 and 12 alongside 9. Just be aware that all this cranial nerve 10 stuff with the vagus is happening simultaneously. So, who's responsible for the functionality of cranial nerves 11 and 12? Well, let's start by reiterating that the GSA, SVA, GVA, SVE, and GVA nuclei that we've all drawn in here are hanging out and contributing to cranial nerves 9 and 10. And just for clarity, we will draw in the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus here, just to reiterate that it's also hanging out in the same place. Cranial nerve 11 is the spinal accessory nerve, and it is controversial in that it's grouped by a lot of anatomy texts, including Blumenfeld's Neuroanatomy through Clinical Cases, which is the book I've decided is sort of the arbiter for what is and is not correct in this series. And it listed as an SVE, despite the fact that there's no pharyngeal arch that contributes to the muscles of cranial nerve 11. It's not quite a somatic efferent either, so it's a little bit of a transitional motor nerve, and it's going to be called an SVE in this case. If your anatomy instructors say otherwise, go with what they say. And then lastly, cranial nerve 12 unambiguously has its nerves, or its muscles derived from somites. So somatic efferent activity is going to be referred to as GSE, general somatic efference, efferent motor, somatic coming from somites, and cranial nerve 12 has a nucleus that projects all these axons out where they need to go. Now let's start with cranial nerve 11. Cranial nerve 11 is odd in that it actually exists in the cervical spinal cord, and its nuclei, or where those motor cells are located, are in the kind of region between the dorsal and ventral horns of the spinal cord, more towards the ventral side because that's where motor activity is at. And all the way from approximately C1 down to C5, or maybe C6, depending on the reference you look at, is where we have these spinal accessory motor nuclei sending motor axons out through the lateral aspect of the cervical spinal cord, and they do something really weird. They bundle together and they ascend without exiting the dura mater, without exiting the spinal region there. They ascend back into the skull, so they have to pass through the big hole at the base of the skull, the foramen magnum, and then they travel all the way up to hang out with 9 and 10. And by hanging out with 9 and 10, it means they go out through the jugular foramen and then take a sharp downward turn to innervate the muscles that cranial nerve 11 innervates. And what does it innervate? It innervates the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So, cranial nerve 11 has this really bizarre course, largely as an accident of ossification. These guys innervated their muscles, and then the bones of the skull ossified around them and stretched them out as the body grew, and innervating the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. If you have a lesion of this nerve, the way it's usually checked clinically is you have someone elevate their shoulders and activate their trapezius muscles, superior fibers, and if there's a clear deficiency on one side or the other, that's a hint that maybe cranial nerve 11 is not doing so well on that side. Sternocleidomastoid's mechanics are a little bit wonky. Essentially, if I contracted my right sternocleidomastoid, I would side bend my head to the left. Pardon me. So if I contracted my right sternocleidomastoid, I'd side bend my head to the right, but turn it to the left. So we'll talk about that a little later, potentially in one of the other videos. The only other thing about these muscles that sometimes weird people out is the spinal accessory nerve here, which is what we are looking at. Carries motor inputs to these muscles, but the sensory inputs from these muscles travel back to the cervical plexus to get to the spinal cord and do not pass back to the jugular foramen. So that's one thing that sometimes throws people. All right, that's really it for cranial nerve 11. Cranial nerve 12, GSE, is the hypoglossal nerve, and it innervates the muscles of the tongue. And its nucleus is hanging out really kind of in the same basic place as all these other guys. So we're going to color him here in orange. I'll be a little aggressive about coloring him in so you can see where he's at. Now these guys don't exist slammed into each other. The reason I'm drawing him over the top of these guys is that in 3 dimensions they're spread out a little bit in space, but right now I've slapped them all into 2D, so hypoglossal nucleus is just a little bit difficult to spot right there. All right, so hypoglossal nucleus in orange is a motor nucleus. It has motor axons, and they send their axons out, and they bundle together to form the hypoglossal nerve. It travels through its own hole in the skull, called the hypoglossal canal, And these are located just superior to the right and left occipital condyles. They're pretty easy to spot, but it's their own exit from the skull. And they travel through the superior portion of the neck and wind up entering the oral cavity at the base of the tongue. And once they're there, the hypoglossal nerve innervates the muscles of the tongue. And who are they? All right, muscles of the tongue are named, thankfully, for what they're traveling from and going to. So from the hyoid bone, we've got the hypoglossal muscle that depresses the tongue. From the styloid process, we have the styloglossal muscle that retracts the tongue, pulls it back in. From the bend or the anterior part of the mandible, the genu of it, we've got the genioglossus. That one's fun because it actually kind of fans out and it makes the tongue stick out. So it's the one that kind of fans the tongue forward, sticks it out. And within the tongue itself, we have intrinsic muscles, and they insert on other muscles. And that's what allows the tongue to be so maneuverable and take the various shapes it does and move around your mouth and clear the oral cavity and so forth, is the intrinsic muscles inserting into other muscles at various angles. Now, one thing, those of you who are particularly attentive might have spotted, is there's another glossus muscle, and it's way back here, innervated by cranial nerve 10, the palatal-glossus. The reason it's not innervated by cranial nerve 12 is because the muscles of the tongue are innervated by 12. The muscles of the palate are innervated by 10, and palatal-glossus is both. So 10 and 12 fought it out, but 10 won, and 10 innervates the palatal-glossus, which helps to elevate the tongue and also depress the palate a bit. All right, that's it for 12. It's pretty simple. And what's not simple about it is lesions. It's an exposed area traveling lateral to the carotid sheath, along with some cervical nerves. And lesions of the hypoglossal nerve will de-innervate your tongue and cause it to atrophy. So if we have, let's pretend my hands are now a tongue, and this side gets de-innervated, it's going to shrink, it's going to atrophy, and it's going to get very weak. Sometimes that's something you can spot, but early on, lesion of the hypoglossal nerve can be spotted clinically by having someone protrude their tongue straight out of their mouth. Now, if your tongue muscles are strong, equally strong on both sides, you tell someone to stick their tongue out, it's going to stick out straight ahead this way. But because of the mechanics of it, if this side is weak and you tell the person to stick their tongue out, the strong side crowds it out of the way as it extends. And so lesions of the tongue, unlike lesions of the uvula, point toward the lesion side. So the strong side crowds out the weak side and it points towards the side that is lesioned. That sometimes throws people, can be a little bit difficult, but I think that should hopefully make some sense. All right, gang, there's only one last thing to talk about, and that is what happens if you have a lesion of cranial nerve 10. You have dysphagia, difficulty swallowing. You have dysphonia, difficulty speaking, but you've also got lack of sensation on the pharynx. You've also got an inability or weakness on one side to elevate the shoulder, but the tongue muscles seem okay. Tongue muscles are okay. That's telling us that the hypoglossal is probably doing fine. But where can we put a lesion that affects the others? Cranial nerves 10, 9, and 11. Could we go in here and just start causing lesions that affect them individually? Sure, but it's not likely. What's more likely, and you want to think about anatomically when you're answering questions, is where can you group all of those guys and find a common spot where they could all be affected? And remember, with 10, and with 9, and with 11, they all have to transverse the jugular foramen. And a space-filling lesion of the jugular foramen, like a tumor, can cause multiple cranial nerves to be affected. So if you can find lesions and attribute them to a single cranial nerve, it's probably affected somewhere along its length. Just like we said, dysphonia alone probably means the recurrent laryngeal nerve got nailed somewhere, causing weakness of the phonation muscles. But if that's included along with lesions of 11 or 9, you want to look for places you could put those lesions, either centrally into one of these nuclei. Maybe there's a stroke, maybe the nuclei got wiped out, or maybe there's something at the jugular foramen affecting all of them. All right, I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you guys have a great day. Adios.